Let me get straight to the point. The U.S. military has been attacked 30 times since the beginning of the war in Israel. However, the U.S. military says the war in Israel has nothing to do with the attacks happening to U.S. military members in Syria and Iraq. And not only that, the U.S. military has finally said if we keep getting attacked, we're going to do something about it. Again, this is after 30 times U.S. military members have been attacked. Okay, so let's start to break down the sequence of events. Israel gets attacked by Hamas. One of the #1 supporters of Israel says, "You have the right to defend yourself," says the United States. And furthermore, to show evidence how much the U.S. military stands with the United States, you had Joe Biden himself fly all the way to Israel for a 7-hour meeting and fly all the way back to the United States. This is a very big step, and it shows that the U.S. military and the United States is willing to do whatever it takes to stand with Israel. You also have further public documentation of U.S. special operations who are in Israel and helping with the mission planning phases for Israel's ground invasion. And again, further evidence the U.S. military is quite literally providing munitions for Israel, aerial assets, and many more means such as missile defense systems. Now, I'm not trying to sound repetitive, I'm just trying to give you guys the full story of how much the U.S. military supports Israel and how this really shows why U.S. military members are getting attacked. Now, even though the U.S. military stands with Israel, they don't stand side by side with them, boots on the ground, to attack into Gaza. This seems to be the caveat for the U.S. military to say, we are not in this conflict, but we are in this conflict in many other ways. When the Pentagon recently makes statements of, we give munitions to Israel, but however they want to use those munitions, that's up to them. When you halt Israel's invasion into Gaza to hopefully get more hostages, the U.S. military has quite the influence on Israel, and again, they have quite the involvement with this war in Israel. Now, as far as U.S. military bases getting attacked in Iraq and Syria, here's what seems to be going on, and here's what the gray area is for the U.S. military. First, let's say the obvious. Since U.S. military members are not technically in the war in Israel, it has nothing to do with U.S. military members getting attacked, right? However, the country of Iran literally posted a tweet saying, "Your time is up." When you put this into context, this is after the U.S. military, U.S. Navy, made the threat that the U.S. Navy is ready to engage any target in Syria and Iraq if they try to make any moves on Israel, but also the United States. Now, when the U.S. military makes the first threat, we have to call that out. This is not like out of nowhere the U.S. military is getting all of these attacks ever since their involvement with the war in Israel. I'm just pointing this out. The U.S. Navy is the one who made the threat. Now, before we got to the number of 30 attacks, we have to also put the story into context that the U.S. military never left the Middle East. Just because the conflicts ended in Afghanistan, in Iraq, kind of, and we're still in Syria, look, we are there. We have many assets in the Middle East, but again, let's be honest with ourselves. We have not had this uptick and a total red alert to be on the watch out for more attacks. The threat was always there, but again, it's not at this level. Now, the question is, who is the threat? The threat are these proxy units. This has always been a known thing. Even with the involvement in the Iraq war, the proxy units, the militia groups who come together to quote-unquote defeat the West being Israel and the United States. Very little do you ever see in context Israel without the United States or United States without Israel. This is for many political associations, religious beliefs, and also ideologies. Now, as far as these proxy units, they have to be getting funding somewhere, and they have to be getting motivation somewhere. You guys let me know down in a comment where you think this funding is coming from. This is not like CIA intelligence, and I'm not like an FBI agent uncovering the secrets. Everyone knows, and Iran has even been public about it, they are funding groups like the Houthis, like Hezbollah. It's a known thing. And this is not me speculating. Iran, they are the ones who are quite literally flying to countries like Syria, Lebanon, and they are the ones having these face-to-face meetings with these military members. However, time and time again, even before we got to the number 30, the U.S. military kept saying, look, We don't know where these attacks are coming from. We're not going to point fingers. We have no evidence to say where these attacks are coming from, but there is one organization who keeps taking blame to these attacks. For some reason, the mainstream media has still not put this name out there, but if you do your research, it's an organization called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. Now, what's really interesting about this organization, and if you watch my channel, you have probably heard me say this, when you go into public databases and you go even type this organization on Google, they do not exist beyond the time of this war. No one knows who they are affiliated with, and no one knows who their leaders are. We just know that all of a sudden they are coming up on Telegram, Twitter, and they are publicly stating we are responsible for the drone attacks. The reason why this is relevant, and they say what kind of attacks they're doing, and the tactics they're doing, and the debris fields of the attacks, all roads lead to one country. There's also another thing I want to point out, is that the U.S. military has technically responded a few times towards these attacks. The first response was known as an FTX, where the internet quite literally made fun of the U.S. military, where the response to these attacks, field training exercises. That's what FTX stands for. Now look, to be fair, the U.S. military, even when deployed, they still do a lot of training to maintain like equipment and to maintain that every member of that military unit is still good at their job. However, again, in context, the Pentagon said, in response to these attacks, we are doing FTXs. The response was not, we're going to go out and get these guys. No, the response is, we're going to train on targets. Now look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. I also want to say this, Joe Biden, we do need to give him a little credit, even though he's not that well loved, even by the U.S. military. He was the one who actually ordered 2 F-16s to finally respond and attack a munition site. So again, the responses to these 30 attacks, we're going to do some field training exercises, and we're going to respond with 2 F-16s. So now we have a third response. The third response, quite literally, again, from Floyd Austin himself, Defense Secretary, is if these attacks keep coming in, we are going to do something about it. But the question begs, and if you look at forums and do some research, people are questioning, why not have made the threat 15 attacks in, and we already made this threat with the U.S. Navy, so what exactly is happening? You guys can go ahead and leave a comment down below why you think the U.S. military is being a little timid, but a lot of indicators seem to point to the fact that the U.S. military is involved with the war in Israel, but they need to be very careful with actually being involved with the war in Israel. And really guilty by association, no matter what, whatever Israel did, the U.S. military was always going to face the consequences of what Israel did, because again, the ideologies of these groups tend to tie Israel and the U.S. together. And due to the locations of a lot of these groups, they're already nearby a lot of military bases, so why not just go after the U.S. military and not so much Israel? So the speculation again is the U.S. military wants to be careful with how much they say they're involved with Israel, but they also probably want to be careful with escalation of force in the Middle East. Let's remember, in the last 20 years, the U.S. military has quite the black eye with some mission success and some mission failure in the Middle East. And again, it seems like the U.S. military wants to do some damage control and wants to have stability in the region. They don't want conflict. How do you get conflict? You get conflict in starting to send troops outside of the wire. That pretty much means leaving your base. Having massive convoys, having Abrams tanks going through villages, going door to door once again. Go ahead and ask any Iraqi veteran how that went. The more and more we did door to door, the more secure these militant groups started to get more and more hype and go after U.S. military members. And look, I'm just being blatantly honest about the situation in the U.S. military right now. You're very damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you do something, escalation of force. If you don't do something, now you start to get casualties. And let's be honest with ourselves again, there haven't been any U.S. military soldiers or members who have sustained a casualty, more so injuries, but there has been one contractor who actually had a casualty from a heart attack while running into a bunker from a drone attack. So let's not kid ourselves. We've taken it to the extreme. U.S. military members, although they take the risk of going into dangerous combat zones, like, okay, you have a casualty, but that is your job and that's the risk. We've reached that level. In typical U.S. fashion, once you reach that level, You roll up the sleeves. I mean, we're in combat now. And don't take this as me being a warmonger. I don't think we should have any conflicts, and I think we should be a lot more careful in the Middle East. But again, this is the U.S. military who made the initial threat, and the U.S. military, they are the ones who they know. We have U.S. service members in these outposts in Syria and in Iraq, and they know the threat of them getting attacked because we are associated with Israel. So here's what the question is. What is going to be the response, the true response from the U.S. military? Are we going to escalate force? In many ways, we already have. We already have many strike groups in the Mediterranean. We have Marines over in the Red Sea. We have F-16s throughout the Middle East, F-22s. We got updated A-10s. We have a unit in Jordan of F-15s. We have missile defense systems. There's probably a lot more, but I can't remember. But nonetheless, like, what's going to happen? What's going to be the response? Because no matter what we do, it's probably going to look bad. And a lot of these groups who we've never heard of before are probably going to be recruiting more members because their backs are up against the wall, and they're going to remember how to beat the United States. There is a playbook on how to beat the U.S. The long game. Hide in the mountains, attack here and there, go back and hide in the mountains, attack again. This is how the U.S. military starts to get beat. So we'll see what happens. It doesn't look like the U.S. military wants to get sucked into another localized conflict. I think that's a good thing. But again, the U.S. military has brought in missile defense systems to prevent more of these attacks and to hopefully stop more of these attacks. But unfortunately, we are up to number 30. At first, when it was like 2 through 5, it's like, okay, we're starting to get attacked. Now we're up to 30. Things are getting a little concerning, and they're going to keep coming and coming as long as the war in Israel continues. As long as the U.S. military associates with the war, and they're going to, more attacks will probably keep coming. So keep an eye on that, and we'll see what happens. I hope everything ends peacefully, but we're heading again into a very bad direction.